The police officer, in a moment of unchecked rage, threw a cup of hot coffee at a 14-year-old black boy unaware of who the boy's father was and the storm of consequences that would soon follow. It all began in a cozy local coffee shop early one morning where the boy, a seemingly ordinary teenager, entered the shop with hopes of starting his day on a peaceful note. He had no idea that his routine would soon turn into a traumatic experience. The shop was light with activity, the smell of freshly brewed coffee hanging in the air, and the boy approached the counter to decide what to order. He was focused, innocent, and unaware of the dark eyes watching him. A police officer, sitting in a corner booth, had already begun to eye the boy with suspicion. His gaze was filled with judgment and disdain, a gaze tainted by preconceived biases he had long harbored. Under his breath, the officer muttered derogatory remarks, loud enough to satisfy his own bitterness, but quiet enough so no one around could hear. He was already making assumptions about the boy based solely on his appearance, his mind working quickly to paint the boy in a light that matches prejudice. Deciding to act on his assumptions, the officer stood up from his booth and walked toward the counter, positioning himself near the boy but pretending to browse the menu. The boy, oblivious to the malice behind the officer's actions, politely placed his order, received his coffee, and made his way outside, eager to begin his day. But the officer was not finished. He bought a coffee for himself and followed the boy out of the shop. His intent was clear, though only he knew what it was. As the boy walked down the street, holding his coffee tightly in his hands, the officer quickened his pace and deliberately collided with the boy. The hot coffee splashed all over the boy's shirt, the scalding liquid burning his skin beneath his clothes. The boy gasped in pain and shock as he stepped back, looking at the stain spreading across his shirt. Confusion took over as he demanded an explanation, his voice shaking. The officer, however, was already ready with a fabricated story. He raised his voice, accusing the boy of running into him and ruining his coffee, trying to make the boy appear as the aggressor in front of anyone who might be watching. Despite the pain and confusion, the boy remained calm. He raised his hand slightly, trying to defuse the situation, and apologized even though he hadn't done anything wrong. All he wanted was to get away from the officer before things escalated further. But the officer wasn't done. He stepped in front of the boy, blocking his path as he accused the boy of assaulting a police officer. The officer's claim was absurd, but he repeated it with a conviction that only amplified the lie he was building. The boy's heart raced as he tried to reason with the officer, explaining that he hadn't done anything wrong. His voice was shaky, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. But his words were firm. But the officer was relentless, grabbing the boy's arm with a grip that was both firm and unyielding. He declared that the boy was coming with him to the station for questioning. The boy, resisting at first, instinctively pulled away, but the officer tightened his hold. There was no escaping. The boy lowered his head in resignation, fear and confusion clouding his thoughts as they walked toward the station. The streets around them were starting to fill with morning commuters, but the boy couldn't focus on them. His world was shrinking to just the officer's unyielding grip and the growing terror in his chest. The officer's face remained emotionless, his satisfaction apparent in the way he handled the boy like a piece of property. Meanwhile, the boy held onto his coffee-stained shirt, the burning sensation still lingering on his skin. And when they arrived at the police station, the officer led the boy inside, causing a few heads to turn at the sight of the young boy being dragged through the doors. The officer raised his voice, announcing loudly that he had apprehended a suspect, treating the boy like a hardened criminal rather than an innocent teenager. The boy's face burned with humiliation as he tried once again to explain the situation, but the officer dismissed him, continuing to push a false narrative and reinforcing the lie that the boy had been the aggressor. The boy looked around the room, desperate for someone to believe him, but no one did. The other officers ignored him, some even smirking at his misfortune. The boy's shoulders slumped, his heart sinking as he realized he was completely alone, trapped in a situation that felt impossible to escape. He was instructed to sit and wait as the officer stood nearby, savoring the boy's discomfort like a trophy. The boy's mind raced. He was afraid and overwhelmed, his thoughts a jumble of confusion and frustration. But amidst the panic, he thought of his father. He knew that his father, someone who had always protected and believed in him, would understand and stand up for him. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, one of the officers came to ask for the boy's parents' information. The boy hesitated, his voice trembling as he explained that his father was the president. For a moment, there was silence. Then laughter erupted from the officers around him, mocking the boy's claim. They ridiculed him, made jokes about how absurd it was for a black boy to claim he was the son of the president. Their laughter, filled with cruelty and disbelief, only intensified as they continued to taunt him. The boy, already on the edge, flinched at the sound of their laughter. The ridicule cut deeper than any insult. The officer who had been questioning him leaned in closer, dripping with sarcasm, suggesting that if the boy was the president's son, then surely he must be the commander of the army. The boy's voice cracked as he pleaded for a phone call, his fear evident. The officers, still chuckling, granted his request, but only with mockery in their voices. "Go ahead, make your call," one officer sneered. Trembling, the boy reached for the phone, his hand shaking as he dialed his father's number. When the call connected, his father's calm voice quickly turned to concern as he heard his son crying. The boy explained everything. The officer's actions, the coffee, the accusations, the mockery, and his father's tone immediately shifted from concern to anger. The president assured his son that he would handle the situation and instructed him to stay calm. Back in the station, the officers began to realize that the boy's claims might be true after all. The shift in the boy's father's tone was palpable, and some of the officers began to feel the weight of what they had done. The president wasted no time gathering his security team, determined to confront the officers who had mistreated his son. The tension in the station grew as the boy sat, waiting for the inevitable. When his father arrived, the entire atmosphere shifted. The officers who had once mocked the boy now stood in silence, their earlier arrogance replaced by nervousness. The president walked into the room with purpose, his gaze cutting through the officers who had once dismissed his son's claim. Without a word, he turned to the officer who had targeted his son. The officer, realizing the gravity of the situation, dropped to his knees, begging for forgiveness. But the president was unmoved. He demanded accountability. He turned to the other officers, questioning why none of them had stepped in to stop the humiliation. He ordered the offending officer to be suspended immediately and formal charges to be filed. The officers who had laughed at the boy's plight were now silent, realizing that their actions had consequences far beyond the confines of the station. The president's fury was palpable, and his words left no room for doubt. No one, regardless of position, was above the law. As they left the station together, their bond stronger than ever, the boy knew that he had learned an invaluable lesson in standing up for justice, while his father had proven that no one, not even those in power, could escape accountability. The president's swift action had sent a powerful message to everyone in that room and to the world beyond. Prejudice and abuse of power would not be tolerated. Disclaimer, this story is fictional and did not happen. It is crafted to shed light on the discrimination and injustices faced by Black individuals in real life, aiming to raise awareness and inspire change.